The modern practice of manifestation began with the old man of the mountain. He was the leader of an Ismaili Muslim sect called the Hashishans, who took their name from the hashish, cannabis plant, that they smoked to put them into an altered state of consciousness, and from which we get our modern word for a political murderer, an assassin. This stems from the Hashishans' conspiracy to infiltrate every surrounding and distant foreign government with a covert espionage operative close enough to a person in an office of great authority to be able to kill them upon command. Members were recruited to the order by being drugged with hashish and carried up to Hassan-e-Sabbah's mountain fortress, guarded by a pit of snakes, inside the walls of which was a palatial garden, equipped with all amenities and luxuries that anyone could desire: wine, women, and song. The initiate, once their thirst had been piqued by relaxation, was then brought into a room and shown a beheaded body. He was told to choose between serving the sect and living in the secret paradise, or betraying them and being decapitated. This usually converted them quickly enough, but if an added incentive was needed, the candidate would be shown the same beheaded man alive and whole, and told that the order could resurrect him to life. His men were known to be so loyal that when he commanded one of them to jump off a castle turret for a visiting dignitary, the man did not hesitate to obey. Thus was born the simple act of conversion by conjuring. The allegedly beheaded man was hiding his body beneath the floorboards and wasn't dead. When he reappeared, resurrected, he was merely standing on a trap door. This was an act of macromanifestation. However, it appears as if micromanifestation may be much, much older. The mythology of the Hebrews tells us that Moses spoke to a bush that burned in the wilderness, but which was not consumed. He went on to lead his people out of Egypt and into the promised land of milk and honey. The Greek mythology concludes the story of the theft of this holy fire from Olympus by Prometheus by describing his punishment as similar to that of Sisyphus, eternal and self-regenerating. While the tribe of Hebrew-speaking nomads wandered in the Sinai desert waiting to enter Canaan, Moses compiled the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In the first chapter of this, which he called Genesis, he described the formation of Adam, the first man, from the red clay of the earth. The moral of this is manifestation. It is born from the flame of the will of the self, and molds us into who and what we are, and how we see ourselves. In this way, the concept of original sin, represented by the theft of the fruit of knowledge over good and evil from the tree of death in the Garden of Eden, is guilt for existence itself. This has carried itself out in all the subsequent attempts by humanity to civilize the animal self and to bring their instincts under the influence of their reason, and has led to the institutionalization of better judgment and higher learning. In short, the negative declarations of original religions against taboos or sins are the keystone of civilization, the ultimate macro-manifestation. The goal of trance meditation is to transcend mundane reality and attain prolonged unity with the Most High within the self. The ways of inducing trance are too numerous to list, and therefore I will not go into them here. All of the most popular are the basis of religions. However, the institutionalization of the experience inevitably leads to more ritual than education. The basic formula is for the raising and cleansing of the aura in a single sitting. In this, the electromagnetic field is concentrated upon in the mind's eye until it is possible to feel the energy of it in the air. Then there is a ritual which differs in every faith that is meant to clarify the aura and set it in an even balance with the external continuum. This is practiced repetitively to keep the soul in good faith. The method of raising the aura is based on the generation within the self of an increase of energy. This should be drawn in through the lungs, follow the paths of the blood vessels outward from the heart, and the fibers of the nervous system upward towards the brain. Ancient methods for awakening awareness included scrying, or the zoning out over various types of meditative object. The method of concentration depends upon the free will of the individual being brought into play. If the mind is easily distracted, as by an ever-flowing, never-ending internal monologue, such as the font of consciousness itself, then it will diverge from purgation for the duration of the diversion. Enlightenment is achieved only by rigorously screening out not only the thoughts that we think, but the thoughts that we think others might be thinking as well. For the aura to be clear, the mind must be clear. The world does not change when we meditate. Only our perception of the world changes. See what you want to see. Do you see something that is not really there? Do you really believe that anyone cares? Often the hardest step of a long journey is the first. For the projection and cleansing of the aura, the first step is seeing the aura around yourself with the mind's eye. The Hindu name for the mind's eye was the Ajna, and they marked it with a red dot in the center of the forehead. The Egyptians also believed in a third eye, seen through by the spirit, and associated it with a serpent standing up from the forehead, featured on the crown of Upper Egypt. It has also been said that the eyes are the windows to the soul. It is more or less necessary to use the mind's eye, because it may not always be convenient to rely upon technology as a medium whereby to see the aura. Also, because the aura is invisible to the naked eye, it is necessary to use the eye of the full imagination, tapping all resources of information, legislating intelligently. This is the technique of passive reasoning, allowing all thoughts to come and bow down before the central silence. Therefore, in order to be able to see complete clarity through the mind's eye, the last lid one must open is the sleep of the self, or the ego. To accomplish this, it is necessary to invert the idea of the self into the presence of nothingness. One must seek nothingness out, for it can be measured by various containers. The cumulative goal in this is that you will be able to see the presence and movement of forces where there are none to be seen by the common eyes. Although the third eye, as the concentration of pure consciousness, is usually associated with the forehead, and therefore the frontal lobes of the brain that lie immediately behind the skull there, one must not discount the importance of the left and right thalami, collectively called the thalamus. This is often mistaken by the layperson for a gland because of its position directly superior to the pineal gland and the pons of the medulla oblongata. It is, however, only fueled by the chemical neurotransmitters produced in these subjacent areas, as is the rest of the brain and the nervous system, and is not itself part of their glandular secretive process. The thalamus is instead a holographic depot from one or more incoming sources to one or more outgoing receivers in the neuron columns of the cerebrum. In order to suspend rational disbelief, which is based on our being accustomed to the realm that we perceive with the five senses, stimulated by inspiration and distraction, legislated by logic and faith, it is necessary to accept that all possible lines of reasoning are equally real, at least in the realm of potential, and that the realm of potential is equally real as the realm of ideals in the mind. It is only after doing this that we may begin to separate probable fact from probable fiction, and to discern for ourselves what is true and what is false, thus determining what is real and what is not. And in this we may, by answering questions along the way, deduce the ends to the history of any event. However, without first accepting that anything might be, then we cannot fully and firmly follow from one end to another, and thus never know beyond doubt that our conclusions are in harmony with aggregate reality. Neither has the average mind been prepared to deal with any infinite concepts by non-trance social exchange, what modern meditators call game reality. So, in order to realize the existence of infinite possible right answers, one must grasp the concept of infinity. This is a sum, such as 1, that is at the end of a number line. Since it would take forever to count to this sum, it is considered equivalent to saying that the number line goes on forever. When we imagine infinite possible solutions, it multiplies this number line of sums by infinity, as though the sums were hollow vessels filled with additional meaning by infinite explanations. This squares infinity because it doubles the dimension of the number line in depth. This can be referred to as the exponential expansion of consciousness. Applying the same effect to a timeline displays the reason. Our ability to see all possible explanations for events as equally true in theory. This is the last vestige of the self to be shed, the locus of external control. As we relate to our reality, we determine what is real and what is not. We come to understand that it is possible to convey greater amounts of information by an appeal to more than one of our senses at the same time, and in this way to know that there are some things that exist entirely beyond our senses as well. This causes us to become aware of ourselves as an ego inside of a mind, and the ability to imagine the absence of this is usually associated in polite society with fear of death. Since it is this very self-negation that deep meditative trance hopes to accomplish, it is necessary, in order to engage in it, to know this ideal conceptual realm of things beyond our senses with the mind. First, one must see what there is not to see. Then one must know what there is not to know. Then one can begin to decide for themselves what is truly reality. This means utilizing the mental realm in a formally systematized way, storing memories and categorizing perceptions according to structural hierarchy. Naturally, the dimensional model presents itself. We may say that, where the dimensions represent parallel alternate possible realities, that each may possess its own truth in potential, and that therefore they again compound infinity with infinity, thus expanding our consciousness into the third dimension, and giving us the form of a rational cube of infinite implications to our infinite spherical consciousness. Just because the human mind can transcend the focal ego does not mean that it has seen its way free of all the limitations of human instinct, however. There will always be different goals to be gained by different souls, and it is important not to let another's path become your own without your knowing. Take, for example, the competition between humandroids, who always want to keep everything real, meaning formalized, and humanimals, who believe that reality is an illusion and want to let everything go with the flow, meaning relative chaos. The former diagnose the latter with various types of mental disease. What follows delves deep into the conflict over the manifestation of socially unacceptable archetypes. Just as the mother may feel postpartum depression after giving birth to her child, so does every single one of us feel homesick for the womb. This is the emotional reaction to the birth experience, which imprints upon a brain developed to the human stage its first impression of death. For the rest of our lives, we try to recreate the perfect safety of the conditions of the womb, until we cannot fend off the forces of other forms of life anymore, and finally give in to death. The human condition capitulates this in its striving for the ideal, the supernatural, and the extraterrestrial, because this is not simply a behavioral condition implanted on the individual human organism, but the culmination of millions of years of coevolution between autotroph and heterotroph microorganisms as small as our DNA and RNA. Get married, otherwise you have turned your unique personal genetic heritage of millions of years against itself and deserve to die. Get a job, otherwise you are not part of the human race, which struggles and strives heroically against entropy. Die of old age, otherwise you will die unpleasantly and be trapped with a bad death imprint experience in the next form of life, which will cycle unendingly without your knowing of it, just as does the birth trauma in the background of the mind in this life. Never abort fetuses, otherwise you are killing an intelligent soul. Always abort fetuses. There are too many intelligent souls already. If you want some examples of untrue things that many millions of people believe anyway, there were a few. I am no better, though, I have to admit. I believe people are hopeless. As soon as the idea that by following patterns we can control the cycles of time is introduced, it is enforced. Since this is an untrue premise to begin with, the present heirs to the knowledge of this fact, originally held by the first medicine men, that is, modern psychiatrists, identify this with physical gestural behaviors as being symptomatic of different lines of reasoning, and begin to use different prescription drugs to erase such different symptoms that are seen as contraindicated by the social patterns established as the law of the land by the local chiefs of governing bodies. Interestingly enough, these same psychiatrists, who differ from psychologists in that they prescribe drugs, are clearly overlooking the taking of drugs as the primary obvious cause of such antisocial patterns, because if they allowed the populace to realize this fact, they would be exposed as addictive substance merchants peddling lethal poisons. Instead, we are given the red herring of tobacco, which is only a good workout for the lungs, and yet, when combined with aluminum byproduct-lined immune system weakening tap water, spiritually and physically unhealthy exercise and diet routines, fast food high in starch and useless fatty carbohydrates such as grease, and trendy designer prescription pharmaceuticals to further weaken the immune system and make it dependent on external sources for support, tobacco is blamed for all cancer. This being the case, it follows naturally to accuse anybody, even only half aware of this degree or level of social manipulation, of their individual biological systems, with being too scared by it to be able to accept that it exists and find substantial evidence for its proof, which makes them a target for being seen as a threat to the national security of the collective unconscious, a danger to themselves and others. This only represents another gradual step in the marginalizing of intelligent citizens who, for reasons perhaps of neurotransmitter deficiency induced by a mother's lifestyle while the fetus was in the womb, cannot or do not partake of the vast and ample fruits of the social system. At this time in history, more and more doctors are diagnosing people as paranoid. The question remains unanswered by the experts if this is because there are more paranoid people now than before, or if there has always been this same percentage of paranoia per population, and it has simply gone unidentified as such, or treated differently. Historically, the realm of infinite dimensions, where all outcomes are possible, has been associated with the jinn, or discorporeal spirits of our ancestral dead. This has led, on the one hand, to the comparison of idealized hyperspace to utopian heaven, and, on the other, to the persecution on religiously anthropomorphic and personal psychological grounds of anyone outside traditional religions who explores consciousness expansion. The weapon of choice against any such hyper-rational heretic has been to accuse them of living in a fantasy world created out of fear of living in the real world. This is a dressed-down version of the same truth preached by the Church, that the suffering of material reality is penance for transcendence. The examination of paranoia has even infiltrated the art world in the past 100 years. Salvador Dali, of the Surrealist school, wrote of his own paranoid critical method for inducing states of heightened nervous excitation for the purpose of energizing self-expression. This same hyper-ration is associated with mania, hyperactivity, and attention deficit disorder by modern psychiatrists, and treated with medicine to return the brain to a slower, more normalized rate of thinking. The operative clause in the persecution of schizophrenia, however, is that it is based upon a pre-existent emotional state, usually extreme fear, such as occurs during prolonged trauma. However, in some, there appears to be no such experience in their past background, unless, of course, one counts the trauma of being born to begin with. Many latter philosophers have gone much further in endorsing schizophrenia as a desirable and controllable mental state. While Foucault wrote of the appalling conditions of mental institutions, where the most common patient is the person diagnosed schizophrenic, Baudrillard wrote of the technological simulacrum, meaning, and simulacra, appearances, of the mass media in the terms of it imitating the gradual increase of psychic tension associated with paranoid schizophrenia and its application in the brainwashing of our entire culture. The jinn of our ancestors became the angels of the church and the voices in the heads of many modern mentally disturbed people. These, too, are as natural as talking to yourself. However, they are more or less independent personalities that are being perceived by the mind. Just as talking to ourselves is merely taking conscious, lucid control of our stream of consciousness by interjecting more concentration into our train of thoughts, so too are the full personalities that we perpetually pass through emotionally merely extra egos from which we can access information. The survival instinct applies to these as much as it does to us, although the resource that other consciousnesses compete over is the central concentration of attention. Our own memories are often reactivated through the appearance of others, or of things or places, as is evidenced by their eventual difference from formal reality, so that, while we perceive no change in ourselves, our memory comes to be deceived into its existence. Therefore, this alienation of the event continuum usually does not follow as a result from anything to do with the mind, rather, with things changing around it with age. So, to say trance is triggered by the transcendence of the ego, or self-concept, simply because the consciousness relates to its root environment instinctually, and can only be metaprogrammed when the ego is obliterated, preferably by the self itself, and in this way open the mind's eye up to the consciousness plenum of the multiverse, is to miss the very obvious fact that this is the very truest reality of the situation, all the time. When this first began, it was simply a detached mental state associated with trance meditation, often over a scrying object, such as a pool of water or a mirror, resulting in a virtual free-fall sensation, a state that has come to be associated with levitation. Then it was associated with the subject of the meditative trance, or meta-object, and at first with the Ka as the vessel of the light body that transported Osiris, the king of the underworld, dead through the dreams of others' sleep. Immediately after this, it was anthropomorphized somewhat by the Hebrews, who divided the astral form into the Ruach, soul, and Neshama, spirit, and the astral realm into the formative and creative, ethereal and material. After the Crusades, the Rosicrucians, particularly John Dee, devoted much esoteric alchemy to the recreation of a body without organs, simulacra or simulacrum, on the astral plane. The astral body has come to mimic the physical shell and not the toroidal electromagnetic aura usually associated with the soul. The astral realm is merely another name, again, for the realm of the ideal. Two modern forms of astral projection are the potential, temporal or gravitational, singularity, and body jumping, that is, moving about in the short range between different people's bodies. These are both presently popular topics in such genres as science fiction, fantasy, and gothic suspense horror, where cosmological or supernatural aspects come into play. All existing religions are ways to hide from children their innate psychic potential. They all originated from mother goddess cults that were violent and bloody. This was at the time when the megaliths were still new, but their builders had been lost, and all lay in ruin, and the tribes of the world ate each other. The concept of time weighed heavily on everybody's minds and frayed the edges of their sanity. All subsequent orders, rituals, observances, and formalizations have been an attempt by the patriarchy to hide the existence of such a time from the records of all the taught histories of the world. Figures from the late Stone Age of voluptuous pregnant women are associated variously with Venus, Inanna, and Gaia. It is held by all native peoples that once, a very long time ago, the entire world had reached the same level of collective intelligence as it has now. It is the belief of these native people, who have never been any less capable of developing industrial technological civilization at any time than those cultures that did so, and that have developed it when they did, and could have at any time, only were less willing, less interested in doing so. That this first great global civilization was less structurally organized than materialism, and was devoted more to the study of spiritual or trance-consciousness experiences. Many modern legends hold that it was because of this non-materialistic focus that humanity fell from grace, and this is associated with stories of the world flood. According to these same traditional mythologies, before this great catastrophe, there was little distinction between the inherent potential of humanity and the plants and animals, and thus all levels of awareness inherent to this earth were in communal harmony. The result of the loss of this was the beginning of the study of the passage of time. This was the era of the mother goddess, the moon, and the womb sky of Nuit, or night. This was thought to, subsequently, give birth to the next great era, just as day follows night with the rising of the sun. Early mythologies about this kind of cosmology began to be recorded at the same time as the study of spiritual metaphysics became formalized. God became associated with the invisible atmosphere that was present both during night and day, and in this way divided the sun from the zodiac. At this time, we are encouraged to begin to grasp the concept of manifestation in the material realm. This hinges upon the Manichaean division of spirit and flesh, which needlessly associates these two with finite and therefore insufficient value judgments. This doctrine is one of the last modifications made to collective dogma on the nature of the ethereal or astral realm, and states that spirit and flesh exist on opposite ends of a gradient, the midpoint of which is the soul. Thus we see that, to move beyond the obliteration of the self and into the realm of pure idea is to become aware of the principles by which all things operate in the realm of base matter. This is the principle of recovered knowledge that can exist in zero time. There are two principal types of material manifestation, and these are on a scale of smaller to larger. It would be wrong to categorize these as true or false, as these are terms defined by relative perception, and manifestation of any sort is a trick played upon perception, usually to divert the primary attention, while the rule of a sensation is being broken subliminally. Micromanifestation and macromanifestation do not necessarily depend on one another, but are both effects of the same cause. Consciousness itself defines reality between these two, and as well depends upon their cause. It would be right to call the original cause of manifestation an event only because this unit is generalizable to a whole universal set comprised thereof. This universal set is time, or the fourth dimension, and the unit of event is probability. The optical obstacle course leads to rhyming ideas. In other words, we can only be as inspired by what we see as what we see can be inspiring. It is thought, therefore, to be healthy to believe and unhealthy to doubt. However, the truth is that no amount of energy anyone alone puts out through their belief can change the fact of the continual fluctuation of energy that is manifestation, and therefore it is irrelevant to the survival of manifestation, whether we do or do not believe in it. The pro-phase of manifestation is projection. It is because of the long-term psychological effects of projection on the weak-willed that manifestation has come to be viewed by authorities as off-limits except to the divine. Projection in and of itself is harmless and actually feels quite good. Its emotional counterpart is empathy, and this emotion is, at least exoterically, encouraged by those same authorities. Projection occurs when holographic engrams are externalized via the thalamus, and meaningful value becomes attached to something external to the nervous system as a memory storage referential. Because alpha waves are produced in the thalamus, the concept of divided or differential time becomes a factor. The result and the cause of the psychological impact on the weaker-willed is consciousness of the eventual loss of the external as memory referential, at which time one will have to legislate between all the things one wishes to remember about the external and all the things one wishes to forget about the external. This is the religious necessity of cloning, for example, for even if you clone some body, you would still have to summon their departed soul into the new form. It has even been proven by scientists that projection, which is also the basis of religion, can occur between animals of two different species other than humans. Their example is Coco's kitten, but anyone who has ever survived riding a horse past a rattlesnake knows this in even less uncertain terms. The keeping of sacred objects is not equivalent, as it was considered in the latter ancient times, after the advent of socializing monotheism, to idolatry. It is merely the earlier, no less sophisticated, associative technique of the organized mental cellular structure of the brain, common to all forms of self-motivating biological organism. The only difference is that of scale and degree of delegation. For modern species of vertebrate life forms with even minimal mental development, this process manifests itself in memory storage and mental mapping. It would be impossible for fish, for example, to navigate in isolation without a form of the same power that humans attach to religious practice, namely, the essentially holographic superimposition of their internal reality with the external environment through a softening of the sensory field dividing the subjective nous from the objective logos. This process in organisms of more highly evolved mental structure, such as mammalian vertebrates, displays itself in the attachment of particular attributions to specific locations and or objects, climbing up through a gradient of quantifiable displays of affection, essentially initiatory in nature, to culminate in the primate branch with the use of tools connecting preconceived intention to the accomplishment of specific endeavors. Finally, in humans, we find the same process. In us, it is tempered by the strengthening of the ego, resultant from the cultivation of awareness, which, it can be said, is what this so-called process ultimately results in. This places humanity in the hierarchy of our own self-created understanding, at the middle point between our own objective animal nature and the subjective eternal aspect anthropomorphized as God. This same process is present both in the domestication of animals as surrogate self-complementarity in the form of living examples of our own ability to subjugate reality to our holographic superimpositions, and in our equally proportioned sensation of being overwhelmed when confronted in our personal experiences with ultimate unknowns. It is this same force within us that pre-categorizes objects of affection for potential usage in moments of emotional crisis, as seeks out causes for supersaturation of sensory stimulus. One of the primary hitherto identified differences in human, as opposed to all other animals, behavioral utilization of this process is the seeming necessity for recognition of mortality connected to the human utilization. The comparatively longer lifespan of the human species seems to allow the recognition of changes to a being over time as occurrences in an identifiably constant pattern, and this recognition leads both to an attachment of dominance to the design, based on the same attribution of final importance to duration of survival, and to a desire to attain to permanence, or at least practice the acquirement of gradual changes to the form of the being which serves as the vessel of transmission for this motivating potential, which is realized both in terms of the temporal template and the raw resource of energy provided by the interaction of consciousness with material reality through the senses. Animals seem to have much less forethought in their collection of stimuli, due, at least partially, to their having fewer items on their list of lifelong goals than the average human. With every world, philosophy, or synonymously lifetime, created by a member of humanity, there arise resultantly a certain number of new potential opportunities for the furtherance of interest along lines defined by the parameters of subsets to the temporal pattern. In this way, humans can produce a unique breed of life which animals cannot, namely, intellectual offspring. On the other hand, as humans and animals share the same amount of overall space and continue to have interaction, the attribution of superfluously identifiable traits to animals by human intelligence seems to compensate for the difference in pace of their otherwise common evolutionary development. It is this conflict across levels of development within the most highly structurally evolved animal minds, between awareness of mortality and interest only in the immediate, that leads to distraction by differences from the essentially intuitive attention to similarities that is truly all our most basic, shared, and inherent trait. There are three essential phases of micromanifestation: a quantum tunneling wormhole, a synchronicity or coincidence, and the assertion of will upon cause and effect. Because we know of more than we are responsible for, all we must do to cause something to come into being because of us is take responsibility for it by claiming that it is ours. Therefore, controlling the process, which is chronologically the last step, is actually the simplest and easiest as well. Just as random fluctuation in pure potential caused by uncertainty created the first probability in the history of our universe, so does this same process continue today in the form of random quantum tunneling through the existent quantum foam. Each of these quantum tunnels is a temporal singularity, creating an interior zero-time hyperspace event. If this event is expanded upon in space by supersaturation of the surrounding quanta, it absorbs and projects at two different distant points in space-time. It becomes a wormhole. The quantum information that passes through such a temporal tunnel or wormhole can comprise the natural ambiance of the vacuum of deep space, a message coded into a pulsed wavelength, or even biological organisms. The geodesic influx of gravitational magnetic energy causes these to occur everywhere all over the globe, and as we pass through them, we react emotionally because our perceptions of what we see differ. We must always beware what we intend, and be aware of what we mean at all times. To this extent, our measure is logic, by which we measure factual evidence against belief and faith based on degree of trust. This determines the scale upon which these two parallel realities come into existence before the perception of the ego as the conscience before the idea of self. The meanings we accept in this way are units of karma that accumulate into the guiding gravity of our fate. The trade in them unwinds the lifeline, making the individual perception of time turn around. What we see will be a mirror of what we can expect, which is only a fraction of what we know, and we know this to be much less in turn than what we do not know. Thus, any form of seemingly meaningful sign that we perceive is, in truth, a co-creation of reality and the mind. Its significance is dependent upon the presence of an aware observer. Otherwise, it is meaningless and therefore non-referential. In different words, the mirror does not reflect my face if I am not looking into it. The concept of the wishing well is a good example of early, possibly prehistoric in origin, human conception of information exchange through a wormhole. Whenever manifestation occurs, there is a buildup of potential energy preceding it that is exchanged through the wormhole into the manifested material. This is the concentration of energy in one place in space-time, as another point in space-time is distorted towards it through hyperdimension. At the moment when it occurs, a subspace quantity of quantum information passes through the temporal singularity. This information is the manifestation. By bending it into the material reality of space-time, the manifest information is inverting the substance of the wormhole from its normal state of potential energy in the fourth dimension. A good example of inversion occurs in social interchange theory. In this area of human development, the rhetorical argument has been refined into the format of introductory statement, thesis statement, main body, conclusion. In this practice, the use of inversion has become common between either the introduction or conclusion, whichever contains the antithesis, and the thesis, leaving the other to represent the synthesis or manifest resolution to the conflict between the two ideas. Because it occurs in arguments even when they are being made with great emotional energy, inversion has come to be associated with the sudden break from tension into disunity, described variously as the situation coming to a head and the straw that broke the camel's back, and is associated with a pressure drop and feeling of compression. The oldest existing description of this is as Simzum in Hebrew Kabbalah. By the same reasoning, because inversion is the reversal of matter and energy, like fact and fiction, from virtual to real particles, it can be achieved by epiche, or diminution upon the Dasein, or pure being, in the here and now. Both of these perceptions are dependent upon variable conditions of the inversion, though. Although the original masonry of Kabbalah, in pure dimension, has been lost, according to modern Masons, the body of literature associated with what has come to be considered pure Kabbalah continues to represent a vast collection of possible techniques for inversion. The languages of Kabbalah are based on the encoding of vibrational frequencies associated with their equivalent factors according to alphabetical number sums. Much of Kabbalah is verbal. Although originally esoteric, it pertains more to written concepts, such as ciphers, associated with the spoken sounds in theory, and to intonations without sufficient referentiality in practical craft. These ceremonies and codes serve as an automatic inversion between the realm of the ideal and that of the manifest, whose full effect is determined only by the initiate's degree of open-mindedness. The literature of Kabbalah serves only in lieu of a theory for true ESP. When my generation was young, and our imaginations were at their peak potential for solution-seeking, our elders tried to reinforce for us, through a ritual, the roles of blank slates, in order to pass on the idea that the only cause of entitlement is timing. While this was done out of the best intentions, attempting to impart their highest wisdom, that there is no such thing in reality as responsibility, only association ex post facto, it nonetheless came to be only as valuable to us as one more distraction in our event history. This has apparently been a problem in education for at least as long as there has been domestic child abuse, for both are mentioned in the Bible, where it says that we must spare the rod and spoil the child, that we must enter into the kingdom of heaven like a child, and where it also records an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The result of this type of socially indoctrinating interaction mechanism overlaying the process of education is an imitation of the official version of global history, where the proto-humans and early Atlanteans are considered the youth of humanity, the flood a coming of age, and industrial technological development work. In short, they give you credit for having already known none of the recovered information you are reawakened to at school, and encourage you to believe that you are only aware of as much information as you can consciously, meaning against the opposition of social distractions, account for beyond the shadow of a doubt, wherein their doubts in you are tested out against you, so that you will grow to fit the mold they have created for the normal individual based on their understanding of the official version of history, which constitutes the entirety of their expectations for you. When we do not play the roles created for us by the expectations of others, the labor will become displaced onto another body, and this will represent the part of ourselves that we have assigned to be exiled by projection into manifestation. This allows us to play the role of God. Whenever there is more than one person around playing the role of God, this devalues the role and causes the entire paradigm to crumble into the dimension of the magic theater, where all are demigod kings, representative of the universal harmonic vibrational frequencies of potential energy in hyperspace. It is these strands alone that the multiverse is comprised of, since all the matter energy absorbed by the black hole and filtered through the wormholes is converted through the inversion engine of the singularity into the baby universe, and the wormholes are only filaments of potential energy themselves. In this level, people are more or less psychic, their own roles and thus their own appearance being distributed out amongst the masses statistically, while they come to resemble the statistically averaged appearance desired for them by the souls displaced from the bodies, forced into secondary roles, etc. The mind is a 5-dimensional hand. It is capable of accomplishing all the same feats as we are accustomed to performing ourselves in the physical world. Its strength is the spirit. It can also palm objects and misdirect attention from a sleight of hand, so to speak. A mental conceptual magic trick is simply a conceptual lie, a false premise based on unjustifiable and wrong reasoning. These are acts of bad karma, even the little white lies. These are considered psychically unhealthy because they introduce dead ends into the flowing progress of consciousness down the infinite forking pathways of the trans-dimensional evolutionary hollow-mnemonic system. Get what you can out of life. This premise is agreed upon by all philosophies. Good karma is giving back all of what you don't want and half of whatever you have left over that you don't need. This is living comfortably, and this increases the probabilities of dying comfortably. Hence, morality has become associated with a rewarded afterlife. In this way, by getting all you can, and by giving back 5/8 of it while still alive, and by setting this process in motion for perpetuity, philosophy and religion coincide. However, religion gives all the glory to God, and philosophy prefers to contribute to more or less humanistic pursuits. Survival is reasoning thus. Any use of reasoning can become corrupt by false premises. These are simply wrong information. Oftentimes, wrong information is created on purpose as with disinformation leaked to intermediaries in order to confuse the heads of competing groups. But most of the time, misinformation arises accidentally. The machine, and ultimately AI, was introduced initially to limit misinformation. However, as long as it is under human control, it is limited itself in how much it is being applied to its goal. It is possible to induce results in reality through the consciousness of others by convincing them of the solidity of your conviction in the concluding inversion at the end of a stream of consciousness that has been gradually accumulating energy within your nervous system. Although it should not shock you to learn this, it probably will, just as it should not shock the audience to see the magician pull a white rabbit out of his black top hat, though it always does. Manifestation, the practical exoteric application of speculative esoteric materialism, has become intertwined with the barter exchange system that has evolved into the valueless token exchange system of capital today. In this economy, manifestations accumulate in aggregates of stereotypes, in genres, and in merchandise. Usually, manifestation is not associated with the performance of a service. This is the purely ritualistic side of money. The world of finance is a complex system of impossible loops that is wholly self-referential. This is not to say that one cannot get in or out, for this is done all the time. Nor would it be fair to class this creature under the same phylum as any form of biological organism that has ever existed on this planet before. It is, nevertheless, what it is, a closed system. All access points are finite events, but there is infinite potential within. Richard Nixon obviously agreed with this philosophy, as he knew that taxation was entirely premised upon disinformation of the American public, when he took the American dollar off the gold standard, thus floating the loans of the nation to every country to whom we owed outstanding debt, and declaring our statements of debit and credit invalid and therefore null and void. Whenever there is an unpleasant reality, the mind's instinct automatically creates an alternate reality for the personality to retreat into. This is simply a coping mechanism that naturally accesses the multiverse, but the same effect can be accomplished by a calm, rational choice more easily. Here we see that the mind will obey all the same rules as the dimensional geometries formed from quantum foam, up to and including the creation of alternate personalities as baby universes. In the same way that all baby universes are virgin births, so is each mind its own unique kind of singularity, neither exclusively gravitational nor temporal. It is in this way that the personality first begins to form self-referentials, or role model archetypes. These can take any and all forms that they like, and operate in an ideal state more or less independently of the self, only answering immediately when called upon, and the rest of the time at utter liberty. We consider these spirits of our own higher being that exist in the ethereal realm just as much and in much the same ways as we do in the material realm. Our ancestors liked to use ritual magic to summon the ghostly memories of their own ancestral dead. However, our knowledge of this remains cold and detached, while our use of the mental projective space remains free to wander with the willpower of our imaginations. The interconnectivity amongst past generations, seen by the shamanic elders of the yet primitive tribes, is much alike the interconnectivity of suburban yuppies on the internet, or rather, like the social party rule of 6 degrees of separation applied to Zen Buddhism, in which we are all just reflections of one another. Therefore, it is very tempting for us to lie to ourselves about such things. For one to hold contradictory ideas, modes, paradigms, or even religious beliefs is quite common now, and there are fewer and fewer authorities who are worthy of answering for that very decrease in deserving authority. Take, for example, those authorities who feed off the repressed desire of their subjects to leave, and you will see the quantities of injustice. Some say that inversion, the necessary transference between opposing viewpoints, their union and or intersection, like an all-purpose right answer at any given wrong time, is necessary for the rolling of probability over from one event to the next. This, in turn, constitutes the forward flow of entropy, measuring the unfolding passage of time, only insofar as this effect on probability is in keeping with entropy's nature of disruption and disorder. It turns out it is not only necessary that it be thus, but a given as well, for it is random quantum fluctuations due to the uncertainty principle that caused the universe to come into creation, and that continue to transport information inside our brains, or even through hyperspace across the universe, to this very date. Still, it is worth noting that the real measure by which we perceive time is by space, distance, plumbed by the speed of light, which is energy upon the distortion of gravity by the substantive matter of the universe, to a field comprised of microwave tachyons, involuting opposite the universe's entropic expansion, thus against time. It is safe to say, by the anthropic principle, that there would be no magic without magicians, just as it is safe to assume that most, if not all, magicians are more or less like you and me, and that, moreover, for them to share a magic trick with us, it is necessary that they inhabit the same continuum. This is the same continuum shared by the mind through manifestation. It is a continuum of pure probability. Pure probability is the substance of prediction in quantum mechanics, which is the attempt by applied mathematics to bring the workings of subatomic spinning particles and force-carrying waves into the grasp of the mind. It is more commonly known to the gambler as chance, and having control of it, which they seem to think happens at random, they call good luck. Science has given us other names for it, the best of which is probability. Either simply means the likelihood of an event happening or not. It is difficult for the modern mind to fully accept that our entire universe, the space-time continuum itself, the fourth-dimensional motivation of our third-dimensional reality, is no more than a fluid math of randomly fluctuating measures of probability, manifest nothingness, arising from and within pure potential, ideal emptiness. But this is the way it is, mathematically. Now this continuum is not constant. The particles of the atom themselves resemble a miniature replica of a solar system gaping with empty space, while even the highest frequency microwave background radiation only vibrates its gravitational waves through subspace in the pattern of the dispersion of galaxies in the walls, filaments, and voids of our universe. However, it is important to note that manifestation, the probability or magic trick, is merely a concentration of potential, or that which we know is between the subatomic particles and in the universal voids, i.e., nothingness, for such as do we know, that amounts to no effect other than the creation of spin in particles or the stirring of force-carrying waves. For if it did, all probability as such would be revealed for misdirection, and the magic would be taken out of the trick. Fermions and bosons are molecules of dimensions. Their spin potential variability is determined by trans-dimensional interaction. The dimensions themselves remain outside of and beyond the forms they generate as the nuclei of two covalently bonded atoms. There is the philosophical definition of the ideal. Before we can consider the specific cases of fermions and bosons, we must delve a little deeper into the nature of dimensionality. It cannot be argued that the first dimension is a singularity, the ultimate embodiment of symmetry. The second dimension is, equivocally, planar geometry. These are ideal forms, impossible to express in our material reality, and exist as realms of pure equations. Without them, however, we could understand nothing of our own condition, and would possess no mathematics by which to quantify nature. In fact, without them, nature itself could not have assumed the forms and functions which we now know. However, even the simplest understanding we possess cannot belong to one of these dimensions alone. Consider the point, for example. Its properties are expansion/compression and scale correspondence, where the former applies to a singularity and the latter to planar geometry. Neither has any meaning except in relationship with the other, and what meaning we do comprehend of either is therefore a creation of both. Without the point, a Cartesian coordinate system could not exist, but without a singularity, there could be no point. This natural progression continues upward through the dimensions, even up to light and beyond, which I have here classified as the fifth dimension. This is due to the unique properties of light, which seem to imply a domain unto itself, particularly as it relates to time. The primary example of this being the seeming trans-temporal nature of tachyons. The fourth dimension should be set aside for special consideration as well, as doing so now will relieve the pressures of later describing the particles it helps to form. The fourth dimension is simultaneously spatial and temporal, meaning that it generates highly complicated structures over fixed intervals. The complexity of its spatial component is due to its having as its foundation an open geometry, in progression from the flat, second, and closed third-dimensional geometries. Its temporal component, however, is semi-second dimensional, as it is traditionally observed to unfold into a binary scalar between past and future. I have demonstrated elsewhere that this relationship is indeed far more complex than this, but in the context of this exposition we need only remember these two defining traits for this dimension. Now we may consider the dimensional molecular cases of fermions and bosons. Bosons, real particles, possess fractional spin as they occur between the third and fourth dimensions. They arise as the result of the interaction of matter and energy between the pure formal geometry of the third dimension and the pure formal time of the fourth dimension. They begin as ultimate, unformed material chaos. As time passes, this mass becomes motivated, and an exchange of matter and energy begins to take place, constructing on a framework of pre-existent geometric relationship to govern the materialization of such real particles. Boson's symmetry is quarterly in three-dimensional coordinate space, meaning in any direction it is rotated, a boson will look the same after less than one complete turn. In other words, its matter-energy structure is determined by geometric, symmetry, and temporal, spin, interaction. These may be measured as either particle or wave. Fermions, virtual or force-carrying particles, arise similarly, but possess integer spin potential variability. The fourth dimension exists in field form, and the fifth dimension in no solid form at all, and therefore there are no geometric restrictions placed on symmetry. Fermions, thus existing between pure time and pure light, can only be measured as waves, and as such obey spin in accordance with oscillation interval, or frequency constant wavelength. The nature of further dimensions, and therefore implications for the particles they may generate through interaction, is discussed elsewhere. Just as we observed that on the scale of atoms, there is a structure which mirrors the arrangement of the planetary spheres in the heavens, with the electron orbiting around the nucleus as does a moon around a planet or a planet around a sun, and that the structure of the subatomic particles themselves is probabilistically regular, alike that of the planets, moons, and stars, each having its own set of characteristics and rules for behavior, and no two classes being identical in either. So must it also follow that the patterns governing over the smaller aspects than the subatomic particles should follow the same structural organization as that which is of the lowest order for the arrangement of information in these larger scales. Thus, for the properties of dimensionality itself, it should be observed the same ordering as occurs with and for the heavenly spheres and for the electrons of atoms, that they, being of an order beneath the spheres of the subatomic particles, just as are the subatomic particles exponentially one iteration beneath that of the heavenly bodies, should obey the same rules for behavior as the orbits of electrons, just as the electrons obey the same rules for behavior as do the orbits of the satellites of space. The force that acts upon all these satellites is gravity, and its constituent particle is the hypothetical graviton. So, the force over the smaller electrons is microgravity, and its constituent particle is thought to be the tachyon. As explained elsewhere, the graviton and the tachyon are really the same particle, carrying the same negentropic force on two different size scales, though smaller than any particle, the superstrings of tachyons are thought to be infinitesimally small, the same force still applies to the substance of space itself, and in this capacity it is called time. Time is a movement which warps space into the shapes of the smallest particles, tachyons, which shape is a torus. Therefore, it is this shape that we must look for in the raw substance of the continuum in its most fundamental form, that of dimensionality itself. And here we see that dimensionality is, indeed, a unity that is divided into a plurality, and that this is because its levels of plurality are orbital paths, like those of electrons or satellites, occurring within the single pattern of a torus. Thus, we see that manifestation occurs as the orbital vector of dimension. As dimensionality itself is revolved, manifestation occurs. In the first revolution, dimensionality manifests the singularity. In the second, it manifests the plane. In the third, it manifests solidity. With the fourth revolution, dimensionality manifests time itself. Beyond this is not known to modern physics, but it is held within the esoteric tradition that the fifth turning is pure light. This is in keeping with Gnostic doctrine, which expostulates that before the beginning of creation there was chaos, and this chaos was a darkness. This darkness was a shadow beside the light of God. That is to say, the act of creation itself, what I have been referring to as the act of manifestation, was itself a solid thing, itself a manifestation, and that between God's light and the unformed chaos, this created a shadow, which was the measure of nothingness, known as the primordial abyss of Ayin. Therefore, manifestation is said to have two sides, a light aspect and a dark aspect, and between them an inversion. But we have also seen that this first manifestation is the manifestation of dimension itself, since there is no smaller measure for the continuum to set it aside from the void, and that it is by the rotation of this first manifestation, that of dimensionality itself, that the manifestation of the subsequent known dimensions comes into being. Now, just as the darkness and the light were the two loci at opposite ends of the diameter of the universe when it first began to spin into form from pure dimensionality, and the darkness was but a shadow of that dimensionality, cast off by the divine light, so did these loci become separated by the rotation of dimension along its orbit, manifesting. The darkness rising up to become the matter of space, and the light sinking down to become the progression of time. Thus, just as the particles of matter and energy occur as though shared electrons between dimensions, like as in a molecule, so does each dimension revolve in its way around the two loci of space and time here within our universe. Now, time is a greater force than the matter-energy substance of space. Together they are a unified continuum, but it is time which is outside of and above space that causes it to be moved in the way of dimensionality. the course of the manifestation of dimensionality itself. Thus, because the two loci of its orbit are the substance of space and time, must pass around and beyond them, so that part of the time, pure dimension, penetrates the divided plurality of the manifest universe, and part of the time passes beyond its confines and outside of it, into and through the multiverse of refractions of the one real time stream, into the hyperdimensions of alternate possible time streams. The shape of the torus becomes apparent when it is reckoned that, while dimensionality itself is orbiting in its course of manifestation between the divided dimensions of the local universe, in between which orbital rotations the particles of matter and energy, among others, occur, the two loci of space and time are themselves perpetually changing place with each other, so that, while around them pure dimension makes an orbital process, within this perimeter also there is another orbital loop being made by the two loci around which the greater orbit revolves. Because of this precession of the inner orbit, we can therefore further subdivide the two loci. That which began as light, greater than the whole of all that is, became time outside of and motivating all that is, and can now be known as time-space, or the external surface of the continuum that is all that is, that which is also called the multiverse or hyperdimension. That which began as darkness and unformed chaos before the creation of the universe, and the volume of space thereof upon its creation, may similarly be called space-time, or the substance of the continuum, space infused with time, the interior surface of the one universe. Thus also it should be noted that it is always space-time that is nearest to the manifestation of multiple dimensionality, that is, pure dimension on its orbital course of manifestation. Now, dimensionality within space is as one sphere within another, and as dimensionality passes on its circuit of manifestation, so space is changed over time, such that the sum over histories of space, or the multiverse, assumes a form to encompass this orbit, and thus takes on and is bound to the shape of the torus. So too does time, which remains a force outside of space that can only be observed as the speed of light squared, thus double itself about the diameter of the interior tube of the multiverse, wherein is the space of this universe, and it is known by the 45-degree angle of its diagonal. Time takes unto itself the shape of a tesseract, or hypercube, of which much more shall be discussed duly. Thusly, space-time is the interior surface of the sum over history's torus of the multiverse, and time-space is the exterior surface of the tesseract that comprises the force of hyperdimension. The relativity of dimensionality precedes that, thus, manifestation, the orbit of dimension, is the shadow cast by pure dimension. Multiple dimension is the shadow cast by space. Space is the shadow cast by space-time. Space-time is the shadow cast by time-space. Time-space is the shadow cast by hyperdimension. Hyperdimension is the shadow cast by time, etc. which may be shortened to: space is the shadow cast by time, time is the shadow cast by manifestation. God is above and beyond, the source of all light. Pure dimension orbits elliptically the double loci of space, volume, and time, motion, which themselves orbit each other, so that space always faces dimension. See diagram 5a. At different points in its orbit, pure dimension casts the appearance of multiple different dimensions. This is called manifestation and is measured by geometry. See diagram 5b. Manifestation is dually active and passive. As a verb, it represents the motion of time. As a noun, it represents the measure of space. When pure dimension is at the antipode point in the orbit of manifestation, space and time overlap to create the volume and motion of the local universe. Diagram 5c. As pure dimension orbits in manifestation, its poles precess such that they alternate in their orientation. Thus, the precession of manifestation leads to the conservation of dimensions, such that plural dimensionality scale compresses to the original singularity of Ylem at the time of the Big Bang. Diagram 5d. Manifestation is the vector of dimension, in the same way as time is the vector of space. Hyperdimension, n-dimensional multidimensionality, is the vector of subspace, the infinite volume, zero mass vacuum. And as the multiverse, sum, is the vector of, over, the local universe, histories. Diagram 5e. The precession of pure dimension in subspace, the apparently flat surface of gravity bent by mass, equals the light cone history, past and future, of the universe in the hyperdimension sum over history multiverse outside of time-space, which is the exterior surface of space-time, whose geometry is different, flat, closed, or open, in different local areas due to the conservation of dimension. 5e. As pure dimension orbits through manifestation perpendicular to the temporal vector of hyperdimension in the multiverse, that is, the precession of manifestation, the past and future light cones revolve around through the torus of the sum over history multiverse, outside of and around the local space-time universe. 5e. The measure of these light cones at the antipode point of pure dimension, where time and space overlap, is phi, or a regular conic spiral turned at a 45-degree angle. Here we see that the light cone does not represent a past and future projection of vector, but the regular degree of curvature to the background radiation in the subspace of the local universe. The measure of the light cones for the projected past and future vectors in the hyperdimensional tachyon multiverse outside of, containing, and surrounding the subspace local universe is the same, but because they are relative to one another along the processing orbital vector of manifestation, as pure dimension casts the geometric appearance of multiple dimensions. The measure of the multiversal torus, comprised of the sum over histories of these projected tachyon light cones in hyperdimension, is relative to the precession of manifestation, and therefore its curvature is pi, a complete cyclical circle. Thus, the measure of the light cones of space-time and of time-space for the finite dimensionality of our subspace local universe is the sum over the histories of the projected light cones of future and past trajectories of tachyons in the multiverse, or phi over pi. Diagram 6. Instantaneous manifestation is defined as the focus of time when potential energy, expenditure, and information being delivered are exactly equivalent, as in the case of perfect clarity upon some particular point, or the passing of thoughts perpendicular to that idea, but of great elegance. Instantaneous manifestation means equalization of energy expenditure in the realm of potential and information being delivered. This pertains to the duty of the messenger. There is much literature on the synchronization of one's mental projective waves of probability to the natural inherent vibrational frequencies of solid matter. There is a strong belief, rarely realized, among researchers that time goes only as slowly as you let it. The relationship of the mind to time is one of the most complex geometries of pure dimension in potential, for whatever is not defined specifically remains present in potential, and thus all the dimensions remain balanced between their outward pattern and their movement of potential. Here we find nothing to confound Ylem or pixelate the subordinate hyperdimension, only pure potential. When we say that it is complex in potential, we only mean that it is simple in fact, though the simple units we are using to measure complexity are themselves only potential. Here we find that, as in all pure dimensions, the relationship described between consciousness and potential is one of energy exchange. Thus we can recognize patterns in event, for here, when the concentration of active consciousness is applied to it, event mirrors the hypercubic form of the fourth dimension. We perceive and catalog the data that some patterns of energy change more than others over time. This is true both for the patterns that arise in the dimensional subspaces where manifestation occurs and for the fields of potential that occur between these realms. Therefore, instantaneous manifestation occurs when active consciousness is aligned directly with the fourth dimensional event. It is caused by the transmission of potential energy from one pure dimension to another in a route circuitous to the subspace between them. This allows for a certain amount of subspace to be left over in the multidimensional, elemental situation of an event, and this results in one of two things happening, each in one of two ways. Either the extra subspace manifests hyperdimensionally, in a way either obvious or oblivious to our extant existence, or in accordance with the argument that all matter is potential energy, in, again, either a direct or abstruse way. In the first case, it would be in a quantum information orbital state close to the data pattern from which it has been shed, and therefore may result in manifestation similar to a thought's line known to be occurring on one channel of your bioelectromagnetic aura. In this way, you could say that the manifestation was close or was aimed at a specific event. This is the cause of both all miracles and all accidents. In the latter case, then, we are in a situation of chaos in closed systems, where there is no hope of predicting the manifestation's relative position of occurrence, unless it was plotted as upon a phi-bound projection from a pi-bound orbit as pure information units in hyperdimensions, or as a phi over pi spiral, assuming one has found sufficient signs by which to measure the positions of these orbits of pure information. The question becomes, which of these perspectives came first? Is it true that, for someone who drew before they spoke, or who perceives instantaneous manifestation as hyperdimensional before material, one could expect that they had actually seen images with their minds before having conceived of in words descriptions of the impossible? In any event, instantaneous manifestation, being somewhat of an ideal meteor, usually is found to occur in the form of the appearance of objects that coincides with a thought line. It may be speculated that this is a type of pre-telekinesis, proving that the great creator preceded the primary motivator. It is said by the bravest minds of science today that the universe began with the first random quantum fluctuation, and I have no doubt that we are still living in this same expanded singularity today. Theologically, this displaces the prime motivator as grand creator, with the uncertainty principle being the only primarily pre-existent condition. The uncertainty principle itself is a factor of the speed of light, which is the inversion between manifestation and entropy in this third dimension. According to this theory, it was the force-carrying photon that was the first particle, a quantum tunnel that was alone without any other points to connect, closed up into a sphere, like real numbers inside and like imaginary numbers outside. Now, however, the mnemonic and fractal expansions of fluctuation within that original seed of the first light have generated the quantum foam, a sea of various frequencies, some combining into harmonic melodies, of the background microwave radiation of our space-time continuum. Thus, when any quantum enters the interior of a quantum tunnel, it can connect to many different possible points in space-time. However, this still occurs mostly, if not entirely, at random, and, it is thought, due to the uncertainty principle. Admittedly, random fluctuation and the uncertainty principle alone do not account for the myriad of patterns that are formed in the universe. If we accept that the universe is a unified field, such as the vibrational model or the multidimensional model, then we can say that it is altogether apprehensible by the mind as itself a single unit. One such model of the universe is the Jachin and Boaz model, known in the East as the Yin and Yang model, which combines two inverse fields, one more manifest, and one more ethereal, one representing beneficial karma, one representing unpleasant karma. It is thought that, though opposite, the two forces are one. Astrophysicists who study this model give the name Ylem for that which existed before the Big Bang, and Zen Buddhists call the energy underlying the universe Qi, and the guidance of this energy Tao. If, as I have described as being indicated by the theory, we say that the uncertainty principle accounts for Ylem and Tao, then quanta themselves comprise Qi. However, another perspective on these same factors is the concept of the primary clear light. This is the state of enlightenment, or absence of kinetic energy in the nervous system, associated with nibbana, or nirvana, achieved by the trance of samadhi or samasamadhi. Thus we have in our hands all the pieces, both modern and ancient, of the cosmological puzzle. Let us see how they fit together. We may associate Ylem with the primary clear light, as a precedent has been set in previous consciousness research. Also, we can see that Qi possibly describes waves and microwave frequencies of electromagnetic radiation in a field of ambient potential energy created by random quantum fluctuation. Therefore, Tao would be, by process of elimination, quantum probability wells. Tao and Qi are yin and yang, good and bad karma, over time. Yin and yang blur out of Ylem in the beginning and into it again at the end. A good example of inversion occurs in social interchange theory. In order to understand the inversion inherent in social interchange systems, we must understand that there is an exoteric and an esoteric side to all social interaction. On the one level, we are communicating only what we are communicating consciously. However, beyond this level are countless others where information as idea is constantly being exchanged, and that we can only sense emotionally as the shadow of our social conscience and relative light of social spirit, and that remain obvious to us at all times, and yet of which we remain intentionally unconscious. If we adopt the notion of ownership over the full capacity for awareness of our mind, as philosophy suggests is the course it has followed since the age of reason, then we must accept that it is only as ordered as we have allowed it to become. If, however, we reserve rights to a higher power, such as any of the versions of God offered by institutionalized religions, or if we give these rights away to a spouse, the state, or the devil, all karma adds up to the same sum, whether good or bad, black or white, namely, nothing. Then we can assume that the world of which we know nothing, and to which we continue to remain blind, is founded upon whatever form or degree of order we imagine associates to this nobody of nothingness. In either event, the only measure we are given to plumb the depths is inversion between the end pointing at us, of whom we know something, and the other end disappearing into the void, about which we know nothing. When we communicate with another, this inversion ceases to be the inversion between something and nothing, and becomes the inversion between someone and someone else. In this area of human development, the rhetorical argument has been refined into the format of introductory statement, thesis statement, main body, conclusion, with the inversion between the thesis and the antithesis. At first, philosophy had adopted this form verbatim to express itself. However, it eventually sided entirely with the dramatic chorus against the dialogue of the bit players in favor of attributing both thesis and antithesis to the same voice, thus delimiting possible reaction and gaining better target audience control. This represents a devolution from the communion of the double helix, inversion between two someones, towards dictatorship of force according to singular wave function, inversion between peak and trough of one something and the surrounding relative nothingness. Although the original masonry of Kabbalah, in pure dimension, has been lost, according to the publicly released literature of modern Masons, the body of literature associated with what has come to be considered pure Kabbalah continues to represent a vast collection of possible techniques for inversion. The literature of Kabbalah serves only in lieu of a theory for true anomalous cognition, by which to communicate the tradition in a way meaning to sing a song in silence. Originally, Kabbalah was all of the esoterica, the unifying geometry of the multiverse, and in this way is originally representative of the twin helix of life. One of the finer points of Kabbalah rhetoric is the distinction between fact and fiction. This dates back to ancient bigotry between the initiated and the uninitiated. The initiated were horrible know-it-alls who were, moreover, rich, while the masses of humanity toiled in debt, starved, and went ignorant. Much of history is the story of the reversal of this fortune up to the modern day, the uninitiated slowly coming to grips with all the secret facts of history, usually only on the condition of their continued loyalty to substandard living status. The terms of fact and fiction constitute the entire language of the social compact as it affects change in the society of its citizens, which it calls culture in order to disempower it, calling itself society proper. According to this agreement, facts move upward through hierarchical systems, while fiction moves downward. Since the concept of a naturally formed hierarchical system, such as the mnemonic growth pattern of a tree or the double helix of DNA, both factors of the negentropic evolution of life, is contrary to the relatively heathen belief in the uncertainty principle as being the only guiding light for all universal being. The full implications of this agreed-upon association go generally unrecognized by the uninitiated. It is perpetually becoming easier, and therefore wiser, to accept that our common ancient ancestors had a much greater knowledge of the stars than their modern uninitiated antecedents. The popular paradigm of dogma has become rule by the elders over the children, and this is becoming safer to apply holographically to human history, perhaps, than it is easy to carry out in actual life. What the forefathers of our civilizations concealed esoterically in their descriptions of the cosmos may itself only be the tip of the iceberg of our ancient ancestors' knowledge. One such governing theory, understood by the initiated but not understood by the uninitiated commoner, is astrology. It is a systemization of the heavens according to temporal differentials. However, the given explanations of it are needlessly complex and convoluted, and have historically distorted the underlying and fundamental practical astronomy of it. It apparently derives from an ancient art known of in great detail at the lost roots of all existing peoples and civilizations. An interesting application of astrology that is often overemphasized nowadays is the possible correspondence of data about people born under the same conditions of timing, determined by astronomical alignments. If such a record were compiled over the ages, it would produce a very interesting tapestry, woven of many various people's lives, and bearing an image that might offer better insight into the overall shape of the human mind than any method before. We know that the ancient people of the earth, whose history is largely otherwise lost, erected enormous stone megaliths in perfect astronomical alignments. Our history of civilization begins with the creation of the zodiac and constellations formed by imagining connecting lines between certain stars in the sky and patterns reminiscent of natural or otherwise known objects. Their exact observations were based on the simplest of means, and, though monumental, their works are aesthetically minimalist and ergonomically utilitarian. They have, however, endured for all time, and many remain maintained even to this day. Because of the ancients' observation of the stars being relative to our own temporally, and because the events observed by our ancestors and the events that we observe are also relative to the distance from us at which they occurred temporally, we can extrapolate the formula that our ancestors were observing events at a time when events other than those that they were observing were actually occurring at the distance to their origin, and that these events will be observed before the events that are going on right now at the distance to the origin, which are also different from the events that we can observe now. An application of this would be realizing that what we are seeing now for a star 2,000 light-years away is relative to what was going on Earth 2,000 years ago, and that what we are seeing now for a star 4,000 light-years away is relative to what was going on Earth 4,000 years ago. This is the measure of inversion our ancient ancestors used between their own social something and the something else of the stars in the heavens, because what they knew of the stars was exclusively idealized, and what they knew of the ways of the earth was exclusively material. This inverse relativity is in hyperspace. It is thought by the modern occult that just before the beginning of the era of the Mother Goddess, and ending with the menstrual flood associated with her divine birthright, there was a civilization that was similar to our own, and in very many ways surpassed ours, particularly in fields of technology. This thought was disseminated by making the writings of the author of the original description of this lost world required reading in the very same educational university system he helped to create. Therefore, although his own words tell us otherwise, the entirety of the world's ancient, lost civilizations have come to fall under the nomenclature he gave to that one land, and any differences between areas and eras is on the brink of becoming hopelessly lost to a semantics battle between yuppie and hippie New Agers, unworthy modern inheritors of the role of eternal torchbearers for Atlantean Illuminism. It is widely known today that around the world there are cities that lie off the shores of many countries, below the level of the waves on the surface of the sea. The most probable explanation for such cities is that they were built during the last ice age, when global sea levels were lower. However, this would mean establishing a much earlier date for the beginning of civilization than is traditionally accepted. Currently, it is taught in our schools that civilization first arose in Sumer, also called Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, as well as, around the same time, along the Nile River to the southwest and the Indus River to the east. The oldest known artifacts of civilization in existence date from this time, around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago. The peak of the last ice age, however, was closer to 20,000 years ago. These are only some of the unexplained artifacts of the late Stone Age, however. Clearly, a great art of stonemasonry has been lost to our times, for beyond our means to replicate today remain the constructions of many ancient megalithic centers, shrines, temples, and monuments, involving the quarrying and transport of solid stones, some weighing over 100 tons, most weighing over 10 tons, and their exact placement in alignment with astronomical signs on the horizon and projecting at angles outward into the sky. Since we also lack the ability to determine when they were moved into place, we do not even know when the hundreds of thousands of sacred stone sites throughout the world were erected, and therefore we know absolutely nothing about the people who did so. We have only recently discovered the worldwide knowledge of the hunting weapon, the atlatl, and now believe that it was already known of globally during the last ice age. The atlatl itself is no more than a wooden spear propeller. Nonetheless, before its discovery, no such tool or implement was imagined by the greatest minds of modern men when they imagined back on our common ancient ancestors. And it is, in fact, a marvelous adaptation to the cumbersome spear that reveals a level of knowledge of physics that anthropologists still consider to be as much of an anachronous advancement at the time as was the atomic bomb in the 20th century. While for the uninitiated Atlantis remains a pleasant myth, for the initiated, the fact of ancient lost, highly technologically advanced civilizations is an ever-present reality. It is equated with the fundamental Masonic practice, as well as fundamental religious doctrine, of confronting one's own mortal finitude. Its inevitable ending has become so wrapped up with the mortal or living flesh that the very word that describes it, mortality, has come to mean instead only death. So, with the world's great civilizations, have all of their efforts amounted only to the myth of the moment of their loss. Many stone monuments are not only aligned with celestial events, but are centered over sources, junctures, or near-surface points of underground rivers. The only known way for finding underground waterways today is by dowsing, which involves using a wishbone-shaped stick held lightly and allowed to droop. There is no scientific method to dowsing, and it has not found any basis in scientific work. However, its success rate can be measured against the success rate of remote viewing and the temporal fluctuation of the Earth's electromagnetic field, and found to correspond. This indicates that dowsing may have more to do with the neural electric sensitivity to Earth's electromagnetic field, and that this electromagnetic field may have to do with the paths taken by underground rivers. It is not known if dowsing is the descendant of any ancient art, but according to the legends associated with many ancient megalithic sites by the indigenous peoples, especially when these same people believe the megaliths to have been built supernaturally by an alien race of gods, the megalithic sites are associated with early wells during the age of the mother goddess, and subsequently with blood rituals at the beginning of the age of the father god. Just as the various megaliths plot the progress of the various underground rivers throughout the land, the alignments between them are known as electromagnetic current ley-lines. Just as they had discovered vast underground caverns and lakes during the Ice Age, when the groundwater level dropped along with sea level, Tennessee remains perched atop a network of deep caves and subterranean waterways and lakes. So did the ancients establish a web of energy channels guided by the megalithic conduits all across the face of the land. This energy was called vril, thule, or orgone energy by German occultists around World War II, although it was also identified earlier by Hebrew scholars as ophanic energy associated with the ophanim cycles or wheels. It is essentially similar to biophysical energy present in the nervous system, which Freud called phi. However, it is equivalent to a very great amount of this, such as Count Orgaz identified with the ecstatic orgasm. The control of this energy in the confines of the biophysical system is the long-time practice of the East, where tantric kundalini channels the chi through the chakras, and where acupuncture and acupressure free the energy paths between pressure points. It is probably not very far off the original intention of both to compare these two schools on the subject of the electromagnetic force, the biophysical and the geographical. However, while the intended effect of biophysical energy channeling is ultimately enlightenment and transcendence of the ego, or self-actualization, it is unknown what the effect would be of establishing a working megalithic electromagnetic current circuit system across the face of the globe. While the simple solutions of the domed ceiling and the support frame modify ancient megalithic architecture very little, the practice of placement above underground water and in geoglyphic alignments of holy sites for shrines, churches, mosques, and temples has been systematically adhered to by all subsequent faiths. Modern churches can be found arranged in various mystical geometric forms and patterns relative to one another and to the ancient megalithic sites. It is believed by some very recent thinkers that all of these alignments are relative to different positions of the geographic North Pole over the past 80,000 years. The first calendrical system was that of the yugas of kalpas in India. According to this system, there were 3 yugas in each kalpa, 1 yuga of the creator, Brahma, 1 of the maintainer, Vishnu, and 1 Kali Yuga, the time of the destroyer, Shiva. Along with this system came the description of an immortal soul that reincarnated through a myriad of lifetimes, seeking enlightenment and perfection. Thus were begun the world's first sects or religious cults devoted to the study of pure number and naturalistic allegorical encryption systems. They describe a blue-skinned race called the Aryans, who have long since vanished from the region, from whom they inherited their kingship by divine right, and from whom they inherited their systems of laws, both natural and social. This was the system described in the Rig Vedas. Of course, as the world was short on civilization at the time, a large part of attaining perfection was associated with civic duty, and thus the same manual also created the class system, where the slave caste served the land-owning caste, and the land-owning caste served the kings. In exchange for a life of servitude, the elderly at the time of retirement were exiled to live in ascetic, meditative, purgative contemplation of their value to the world and brace themselves for the impact of their eventual demise. It was these people who, in their aged wisdom, began the original orders of spiritual attainment and outlined the parameters of much subsequent research. The Thuggees cult was the first to perform ritual human bloodletting as part of a sacrificial ceremony to Shiva. Because this was done over stone idols consecrated to the deity, these became known as patro rites, Latin for stone. This would not be the last of bloodletting cults, which continue to this day. The ancient Hebrews sacrificed animals, the Aztecs gave up their own young, and modern voodoo places hexes using blood as a medium. All people throughout history have shed blood for war, and almost all, if not all, have put prisoners of such wars up for public execution, even in cases where the war is a civil war or only a political revolution. This has been the case. The melancholia described variously by all great minds throughout all time was the subject of the meditations of a particular Hindu prince turned monk. He came to believe that the material world was an ever-changing illusion, and that the depression and futility felt by most people with their status in the social hierarchy would be dealt with best by greater spiritual benefits than were offered by traditional reincarnation. The Buddha taught that the world could be transcended by degree, and that, at a state of ultimate transcendence, it was possible to leave reality altogether and to ascend beyond the physical form for as long as one wanted. There is a city off the coast of Yonaguni in the islands of Japan that is believed to date back 10,000 years at least. It has evidence of the same smooth-surfaced, several-ton stone masonry known from megalithic sites throughout the world. There is no reason to doubt that civilization beginning some 5,000 to 7,000 years ago in India could have come directly from this large site in nearby coastal Japan. It is known that during the Ice Age, the islands of Indonesia between the Indian Peninsula and New Zealand were all connected, forming one giant land bridge uniting Asia to Australia. The only question is why a technologically advanced people who had migrated far to the east would migrate back to the west and up the Indus River when the end of the last Ice Age returned sea levels to their present height. There is evidence in Siberia, Russia, northern Asia, that thousands of huge woolly mammoths from this time were flash frozen with tropical vegetation undigested in their stomachs. This opens up the possibility that this group of Atlanteans might not have had any choice as to where they were navigated, since it may have been the only hospitable environment at the time. While the Rig Vedas were still a primarily oral tradition, Sargon the Great unified Upper Akkad and Lower Sumer and created the first system of writing, hieroglyphics, which, it has only recently been discovered, predates even Linear A and Linear B, the predecessors to cuneiform, which would lead, in turn, to Sanskrit, the language in which the Rig Vedas would eventually be written down. At this same time, this great ruler who came out of Sumer developed the system of representing counting by numbers for the purpose of stocking inventories of staples, for the purpose of trade-based distribution amongst the people. This would eventually lead to the creation of the concept of money. or arbitrary value. Sargon spread the myth of Gilgamesh, the survivor of a great flood, and this was the world's first written work of literature. It is particularly astounding because it is held exclusively as a work of fiction, without any sort of cult attached to it at all, such as is the case with many other accounts of the world flood. Like Plato's account of Atlantis itself, Gilgamesh remains held as mythological speculation, accepted even by the people of the time as a flight of fancy, falsity, fallacy, fraud, or fiction. It is known that, while the Hindus followed cycles of many hundreds of thousands of years, the Sumerians were primarily interested in yearly cycles, and cycles related to crop seasons for planting and harvest. To this end, it is thought by modern scholars, they created the 12-month zodiac. For whatever their reasons, they were the ones to originate, 4,000 years ago, all of the signs of the houses as we know them today. Some of them seem natural. Sargon was known as the Scorpion King, and hence Scorpio the Scorpion, simply an indigenous animal. Others, however, are quite arcane, such as Aquarius the Water-bearer, or Sagittarius the Centaur, or Capricorn, part goat, part fish. These have been, however, faithfully preserved through the ages in this exact form until today. Though they were life or death to ancient mariners, they are almost totally ignored by the uninitiated of today. While the zodiac of constellations given for the solar system's ecliptic orbital plane is credited to Babylonia, the first full chart of all the animisms for the different parts of the night sky in the whole year's northern hemisphere comes to us from New Kingdom Dendara in Egypt. The Egyptians carried astronomy into far more than this single, simple motif, however, incorporating divine measurements and observations of the heavens into every single work of art and craft they produced. The most recognized of these, even in ancient times, are the Great Pyramids of Giza. These are 3 enormous stone megalithic structures constructed to align with the belt of the constellation Osiris, modern Orion, as part of a massive-scale geographic representation of the constellations on the surface of Earth. The tips of the pyramids also align according to a phi spiral, a shape unfolded from the expansion of an irrational number. Buried next to the Great Pyramid, and on display there today, is a large, beautiful, seafaring boat. The cult that most profoundly embraced the harmonious parity of yin and yang, or Jachin and Boaz, was that of the Baptist Essenes, known also as the Poor Nazarenes. The Essenes of the order wore white robes, and the Nazarenes of the order wore black robes. However, they merely represented the left and right hand of the same organization, the Nazri ha-Barith, or Keepers of the Covenant, the esoteric Masons of the exoteric Hebrews of the era. This was the inspiration for the later Order of the Knights Templar, whose emblem was 2 brothers on 1 horse. Though both the Templars and the Essenes were practitioners of communal property, the Templars began the system of banking that is still in use today. The Essenes, on the other hand, dealt in esoteric doctrines and were fundamentally determined to form a unified description to fit all existing dogma. The Brothers of the Path of the Black Hand went on to form the cult of the Assassins, who inspired the Templars. It is thought by some that the bloodline of Jesus, the Essene Buddha, moved to France and eventually to Scotland near Stonehenge, a famous megalithic site. During this same time, the Muslims of the Middle East spread west across Africa as far as the Atlantic, then crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and took Spain in Europe. What motive would either of these peoples have had to seek territory in Europe, a miserable land populated by heathen barbarians, the Gales of France, the Anglo-Saxons of Brittany, and the Normans of Germany? Aside from the treasures of many thousands of megalithic sites on land, there is a city off the coast of Spain that would have been common knowledge to the utopian, map-preserving astronomer Moors. The only real question that remains is whether or not Julius Caesar, ignorant swine that he may have been, knew of the significance of these sorts of sites during his Gallic campaign, just before crossing the Rubicon, re-entering Rome and declaring himself its savior. Long before Columbus and the conquistadors of Spain landed in America to colonize it for Christianity, the indigenous peoples of the region maintained oral and sometimes petroglyphic depictions of ancient times according to astronomy, and preserved traditions of a recent cataclysmic flood that had destroyed the original peoples of the area, and which only a few families, high atop various mountains, survived. Since by now we can see that this myth is so common, we can see that it likely dates back to a time when all the peoples of the earth were unified. When comparing the sports games played by the Maya with a rubber ball to the contemporary gladiator games, chariot races, and mock sea battles at the Colosseum in Rome, it becomes easy to see that the world is always, and will always be, unified, on the same wavelength, the Schumann resonance of the Earth's electromagnetic field, which is about 7.83 Hertz. The indigenous people, even to this day, preserve the oral traditions of their heritage, including various spiritually complex cosmologies. In North America, the first peoples to develop civilization were a tribe of cliff dwellers called the Anasazi, who would go on to build the first cubical astronomical observatory in human history. Their ways were peaceful, and they knew no war. Then, the neighboring clan of the Chaco Valley, Grand Lodges, came in and devoured them. Their culture was literally consumed by the Chaco, who built a great round observatory that, from the similarity of which to a Masonic lodge, earned their houses their name. The likely mechanism of the original turn in both cultures of attention to the heavens was the psychoactive mushroom psilocybin. Similarly, it may have been peyote cacti which awoke the cannibal impulse in the Chaco. In South America, civilization evolved much sooner, about 5,000 years ago. The oldest civilization is thought by modern anthropologists to be the Olmec, who carved remarkably African heads out of giant stones in the jungles of Mesoamerica. Almost nothing is known about them, though they were thought to exist for so long. They left few megalithic sites, and these were all pyramids similar to the ziggurats in Sumer. They are usually compared by modern scholars to the pyramids of Egypt, but these, the same scholars think, were built up as monuments on top of or around underground chambers containing tombs, whereas both the Sumerian ziggurats and the Mesoamerican temples have steps leading up to the top, at which is a small hut wherein lived the ruler or shaman, and before which there was a small altar for making a blood sacrifice. This identifies the origin of recognized civilization in South America, clearly with the beginning of the age of the Father God. The second civilization to arise in South America were the peaceful empire of the Maya, who venerated above all things astronomical events represented by megalithic monuments, such as pyramids in the same Orion arrangement as found in Egypt, along a great flooded roadway known as the Way of the Dead. It is thought that their culture also venerated the 7 sisters of Pleiades because of a peculiar offset in the alignment of many of their sacred sites. However, this difference from orientation to modern true north is only meant to signify orientation to a more ancient true north, when the North Pole was located in a different place on Earth. In the Pacific Ocean, on Easter Island, at an unknown time, over 600 monolithic heads were set upright, each weighing several tons. These provide a double-edged mystery, for, assuming the first people to arrive on the island, whether they arrived 6,000 years ago or 600 years ago, had the technology to raise the monolithic edifices, is entirely contingent upon admitting that they had the technology to build seafaring boats out of thatched river reeds to get there in the first place. These ancient people, now forgotten by the indigenous people of today, left behind also a pictographic language called Rongo-Rongo writing, the ideograms of which are strikingly similar to later Chinese characters. In the Atlantic Ocean, near the Bimini Islands, near Bermuda, there is what appears to be a road or the top of a wall under the surface of the shallow sea. The blocks are divided regularly and evenly, although some people argue that this could be a natural occurrence, only a formation of the waves. This particular area was predicted by psychic Edgar Cayce only some 20 years before as being the area where we would begin to see Atlantis re-emerge from the ocean. It is also at the southernmost tip of the Bermuda Triangle, an area in the Atlantic where more boats and planes have disappeared than any other spot anywhere else in all the seas. Recent discoveries by ardent researchers indicate that the Nazca natives were in fact the first civilizers in South America, earlier even than the Olmecs. They traced out perfect geoglyphs of their zodiac and ley-lines miles long in the Nazca Desert, large enough to be seen from space, and their skulls had all been lengthened, presumably by some form of artificial means. We have seen throughout history how the lost cities have guided the evolution of societies. Remember that it is only the modern occult, in particular the OTO, as revised and reconstituted, right, proper, free, and associated masonry, according to Aleister Crowley, that traces back the lineage of the age of the Mother Goddess, beginning 6,000 years ago, the Father God, beginning 4,000 years ago, and the crowned and conquering Child, beginning 2,000 years ago. The 2,000-year cycle is between the sun's alignment with the earth during the solstices or during the equinoxes, and this determines long-term weather on Earth. This is only part of the much larger 24,000-year precessional cycle, during which the pole pivots 360 degrees about the polar regions of the Earth, causing the sun at Earth's equinox to seem to precess through the constellations along the entire ecliptic. This cycle is in turn in flux with the alignment of the ecliptic, which appears like a coin coming to rest after spinning on a tabletop in extremely slow motion, with the center of the galaxy. This latter cycle interacts with the sun's electromagnetic field. The combination of these cycles results in the 48,000-year Ice Age cycle for Earth. It is believed by all of the few who know of it now that all of this was known of by everyone in ancient times as well. The first task of the ancient order was to anthropomorphize the alignment of the point in Sagittarius, where the ecliptic overlaps galactic core and the sun in various seasons. It was thought that the changes in the electromagnetic field of the sun and the earth could be used to predict climate changes in the polar regions of Earth, which would precipitate changes to global coastlines. As the plane of the solar system gradually rotated around, its only spin the orbiting planets, slowly wobbling back and forth relative to the center of the Milky Way, and the Earth precessed in its rotational axis relative to the plane of its orbit. Earth's axis of orientation to the Sun gradually changed relative to the time it was aligned with the Sun and galactic core, such that, it was thought, when the electromagnetic effects coincided with a winter season aeon in the north or south hemisphere, there was an increased possibility of an ice age there. Since the alignment alternated between equinoxes and solstices every 2,000 years, the Ice Age cycle took nearly twice the full precessional cycle before the signs began to enter this winter season. Some of the suspected electromagnetic effects include reversal of magnetic polarity between positive and negative. The earliest as well as the greatest civilizers were deified by the classes they created, and all were made to stand for anthropomorphications of the precession of the solar alignment with galactic core, thus being given the same history and duties. One of the earliest of these is the archetype of Thoth, who recurs in the alchemy of the Middle Ages as Hermes Trismegistus, who knows the secret of how to transmute lead into gold. It is believed that this is what started the quest of the Templars as well, who believed that orichalc, the fabled metal of the Atlanteans, was obtained in ancient times beneath the Temple of Solomon by some extreme concentrated heat source. This may make them sound crazy, but they did subsequently get rich, though it may only have been for the knowledge of the very same Dead Sea Scrolls available to all today, and they may have never sought anything other than these scrolls in Jerusalem, the city of Lucifer, the rising star. These scrolls do contain fragments of the Book of Enoch, believed by some to be attributable to Thoth. The corpus of Thoth is Kabbalah, the hypercube of time. Today, time is considered a fourth dimension. However, the temporal force, whose agent is entropy, is not weighed like the other spatial dimensions. There is also thought to be a fourth spatial dimension, and we use constructs from it to stand for concepts of time only because the geometries overlap conventionally, according to folk wisdom or common sense. From this we derive the hypercube, or third spatial dimensional shadow of a fourth spatial dimensional cube, properly called a tesseract. The hypercube is a cube within a cube, and when we weigh the outer cube as the continuum of time, nuit, and the inner cube as the moment of an event, hadit, then we reopen the ancient wisdom of the Kabbalah, associating the temporal dimension with a higher spatial dimension that can be perceived only through geometry. The Kabbalah is considered a right proper meditative object upon which to perform an epoché, and thus invert Dasein from being for others to being in itself, and in this way transcend the ego and achieve enlightenment. The finest equivalent object in the lower third dimension of manifest subspace, a wholly imperfect world, is the nearly precisely aligned molecules of certain natural rhomboid crystals. These have become known as show stones and associated with the prediction of the future. They establish a nearly perfect harmony of frequencies aligned along their linear arrangements of molecules. First, it should be noted that scrying is the attempt to instantaneously manifest an accurate reflection of the future of a fractal time pattern in the form of a micromanifestation that serves to suspend the observer's disbelief. It mainly uses some form of medium as a tool, though the experience is ultimately neither finite nor bounded by any delimiting measure. What we call life is only a form of scrying that our spirit is doing to our body through our soul. Similarly, what we call communicating is only scrying of idealized concepts between the bodies of two souls. Scrying is the universe looking at itself. The first recorded scryer in history was an Egyptian of little note named Nephotes. His accounts make it obvious that he was familiar with the art only as if one among many who had some practical knowledge and could call themselves skilled craftsmen. His tone goes so far as to imply an entire class of scryers, soothsayers, and fortune-tellers in ancient Egypt. This may have represented the first trade guild unionism by working-class men, and the first step toward commerce in the trade of goods and services, already perfected during the age of the Mother Goddess, in Babylonian temple brothels by the priestess prostitutes. If this is true, then Nephotes can rightly be credited, not single-handedly, but as among a class of men, with the pre-Socratic elementalist and atomist movements, which have become what we know of quantum mechanics today, and deserves more credit, therefore, than to be canonized in Greek mythology as the boy who turned into stone looking at his own reflection in a running brook. The system of the Enochian hosts inhabiting the 30 airs, created by Dr. John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly in the 16th century, is the most complicated endeavor to date derived from scrying. According to Dee, Madame E, his holy guardian angel was contacted and guided him through the realms of the angels and showed him the right proper construction of his Enochian system. It bears little in resemblance to the Watchers described by Enoch, from whom Dee's heavenly characters took their collective name, except for a 12-month calendar with only given names of the months, the guardian angel for each, given by Dee, and the deacons. This may have represented the lunar zodiac, but if it were applied to the sun, then it could also be set to measure precession. The system Dee created is an unfolding of the ruling planets in the 3 deacons of the 12 houses of the signs, multiplying this pattern out to a factor of 2 by the 4 elements. When it is taken to form a cube, as it was by Aleister Crowley in his design for an altar for the Golden Dawn, it should be thought of as a fractal hypercube, or Menger sponge. Inside of it are the Watchers, guarded by the 7 angels that watched the Watchers. The name of the woman that gave them all wings was Becca. The demiurge of the sexual instinct, known as the Great Serpent Kundalini, wraps itself around the auric egg and grows wings, one of light feathers, one of dark. The Great Serpent force was known in ancient South America as the plumed serpent or feathered snake Quetzalcoatl, representing the movement of the aura over time. This force upon perception is undoubtedly the fading afterimage upon our genetic memory hologram of yet more ancient dinosaurs, the enormous thunder lizard predecessors to all modern forms of reptile and bird, and even mammal. This strange ghost, often known as Choron's own, the discorporeal essence of the ether, still haunts us in our perception, and nothing is clear. Distance learning. Diversion of spin onto a different dimensional level, directing the concentration of perception in active consciousness toward a certain person, object, or location. In these times of product branding, youth market angling, and target audience product placement, and of the body without organs in virtual reality in general. The focal point for trance meditation is no longer restricted by any bounds. It can be near or far, stationary or moving, past, present or future, fact or fiction. It is as easy to channel the living as the dead now, courtesy of up-to-the-minute live coverage of breaking events by the all-too in-your-face news media. This is one good yoga move away from being just lucid dreaming, so detached is it from the manifest corpuscle. Taking society as the macrocosm, and bands of individuals as the microcosm, it pits the one against the other as the old humandroids and young humanimals. The universe resembles the nervous system. The walls and filaments of galaxies, strung throughout the empty voids, resemble the neurons linked at the axon-dendrite gap, branching out in synapses in all directions. Freud described the gradual accumulation and spontaneous release of surplus, which he called hypercathexis, of the electrochemical energy of the nervous system, or phi, as being the source and cause of ego or personality. Not all of the phi in each neuron would transmit during regular cathexis, and then some would be available for use in making conscious decisions, or hypercathexis. This is similar to the way the universe works. The many millions of galaxies variously align with each other, affecting their electromagnetic polarity, and this causes the transport of conditions from one location in the system to another. These alignments cause a finite number of gravitational reorientations, and this affects change in the universe. I have no doubt that the universe will end due to an effect essentially similar to Freud's conception of hypercathexis.